Hello and welcome to This View of Life magazine. I am Hadassah Head and I'm a managing editor here at the magazine. Today I will be interviewing biology professor Miryam Wahrman from William Paterson University in New Jersey. She earned her PhD in biochemistry from Cornell University. Using genetic engineering technology at Sloan Kettering Institute, Dr. Wahrman cloned the first human colon carcinoma cDNA library, a set of cancer cell genes, establishing a useful resource for cancer gene research. She was the embryologist and part of the Mount Sinai in vitro fertilization team that produced the first test tube baby in New York State. And she has done research in cell biology, developmental biology, marine biotechnology, and microbiology. Most recently, Dr. Wahrman has pursued her interest in bioethics and published a book, Brave New Judaism, published on Brandeis University Press, which addresses Jewish perspectives on bioethics, genetic technology, reproductive and biomedical science. She also serves as science correspondent for the New Jersey Jewish Standard and has won awards for her coverage of science and health. Welcome.
Thank you, Hadassah. It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor to be part of your work at this special magazine.
Thank you. So, genes.
Genes, yes, we're all interested in genes.
Right. So, I guess my first question is, how do you see your work relating to evolutionary science? For some people, maybe genes and evolution are just so linked that it's obvious, but I feel like you might be able to get through a genetics program primarily without talking about evolution and really focusing on on the work and the kind of the reductionist science that's going on.
Yes, but I teach biology from freshmen all the way through graduate students, and there is no course where we don't discuss evolution.
Okay.
Because evolution is one of the main foundations of biology. So when I start in human biology with non-science majors, we start off by talking about evolution, because we have to consider why we're here today and how did we get here in our world that's so rich with various types of wildlife. Where did this all come from? And so we go back in time about 14 billion years and we begin to discuss the origins of the universe and all of the steps that led up to where we are today. So it is a foundation in every single course.
Okay.
And in particular, genetics.
Right.
When we talk about genetics and we talk about what our destiny is and how our genes determine what our physiology and what our physical nature will be, those genes are here because of the millions and millions of years of evolution.
Great. So you have really gotten, as we said in the introduction, you're really interested in bioethics. And I've been reading your book here, and I was really interested, especially I thought was relevant, your chapter on judging genes.
Yes.
And there you bring up a concept called bottlenecking.
Sure. Well, when we look at the populations that we have, the various populations around the world, we discover that people who originated in different parts of the world have higher incidence of certain genes within that population. So my particular interests are the Ashkenazi Jews, because I'm a member of that group and I've studied a lot about the genetic, the various mutations that appear in higher incidence in that population. But of course, every population has their own genetic quirks. The Irish and people from Southeast Asia and people from the Mediterranean basin, every area of populations that have been isolated more or less within a particular area, they have accumulated a certain specific genes that are in higher density or higher incidence in different populations. The specific genes that we find in different populations, they arose in a small number of, and when populations are small numbers, there may be one individual who develops a mutation. And that individual is said to be one of the founders of that population. When the population grows in number, like the Ashkenazi Jews, there was a period of time in history when there may have just been tens of thousands of Ashkenazi Jews in Eastern Europe. And amongst that population, one or a handful of people developed various types of mutations. But then they went on to have many, many descendants. So we have genes like the BRCA mutation, that one of which came from a particular individual who had that mutation, and that person had offspring and many descendants, and now every person who has that particular mutation has a higher incidence of a cancer risk. But they're also all related to each other because they're all descended from that original person who had the mutation. And that is one way that evolution works in terms of establishing particular traits within the population. Now, the big question is, why do some of these mutations that appear to be deleterious, they're damaging, why do they stick around in populations, and why do they even increase in some populations in terms of the percentage of individuals who carry that gene? Now, we haven't discovered all of the answers to that question. One of the answers is simply that once the gene is in the population, it's not going to disappear. Unless all of the individuals that carry it perish before they reproduce. And most of the genes we're talking about don't do that. Okay? A recessive gene can be in a population, and it can be passed from generation to generation without any effect, and even not even knowing about it unless you get genetic testing. It's only when two copies of the recessive gene get together in a couple and their offspring, there's a 25% chance that one of their children would have both copies and would suffer from a serious genetic disorder. But that recessive gene is going to continue from generation to generation.
And just to bring it back for maybe some audience that doesn't have too much biology background, we're talking about, I remember in high school, we had the little chart when we were talking about recessive genes.
Yes.
And generally, I think we use the example of blue eyes or some such, that you have the genes from both, and you can work it out to see. Yes,
the Punnett square.
And that's what it is.
The Punnett square. It's a little chart that you make, and it shows that if both parents have one copy of a recessive gene, then and the other copy of every person has two copies of every gene for a particular trait. So you can have one good copy and one mutated copy, and you would still be healthy. But then there's a 25% chance that for any given child that it would have both copies and would be affected by the disease. Now, big question in terms of evolution is why these mutations appeared and then were sustained in the population. And we're beginning to learn for some of these diseases that having one copy of the gene could be advantageous for survival. And the best example, of course, is sickle cell anemia. When a child has both copies, they have a very serious lethal disease. But the parents who are carriers, who only have one copy of the gene, turns out that those people have an increased resistance to malaria, and that gives them an advantage. And in evolution, when you have an advantage in terms of survival, then those individuals will have a better chance of having offspring, of having children. And so that's why you may have an increased incidence of that type of gene within populations in malaria-stricken regions. There are a couple of other examples, but they're not totally proven. There's just a correlation between some of these genes and resistance, for instance, to bubonic plague, resistance to HIV/AIDS is an interesting one. There is a gene that confers resistance to HIV, and it seems to have originated in populations where there was a higher incidence of bubonic plague, and they also said maybe smallpox, and that's why it might be appearing at higher incidence in some populations. So I guess the idea of evolution is what types of genes and traits give you a survival advantage, not just for you to grow old, but for a person to have more children, more offspring. And then within that population, those genes will spread more.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you are you've done a lot of looking into Ashkenazi genetics. You do a really nice job in your book, kind of contextualizing this and dealing with the potential stigma for all the research into Ashkenazi genes, especially negative genes. Could you do that here? Could you talk about kind of the reason why there's so much research into Ashkenazi Jews?
Well, Ashkenazi Jews, I guess, are a very cohesive group and have been for a long time. Also, many tend to be highly educated, and as you know, the old joke is that my son the doctor, right? My daughter the doctor. That's a very Jewish mother type of a thing to say. But within the population, there is an interest in scholarship and learning and contributing to the field of knowledge. So Ashkenazi Jews are very willing to participate in genetic studies and genetic screening. And I know of a number of people who are very willing to participate because they feel that they're going to add to the field of knowledge. So we do know a lot about the genetic mutations in the Ashkenazi population. And the screening programs that exist for Ashkenazi population are very sophisticated and advanced. So for instance, if a young couple where the husband and wife are both Ashkenazi Jews, they will be counseled to go and get genetically tested before they conceive a child. There are now about 11 or 12 different tests that can be conducted for various diseases that occur in higher incidence in the Ashkenazi population. And it's not uncommon for young couples to be tested. In fact, it's encouraged. Because once you know that if both members of the couple are carriers of the same mutation, then they have a higher incidence of having, a very large, high chance of having a child with that disease. So it's very positive development in terms of preventing certain diseases in the population. Now, for instance, I'll give you an example. The Tay-Sachs disease is lethal at a very early age. Kids who are born with Tay-Sachs, they don't live very long, and their couple of years of life are really heartbreaking, because they may develop for a couple of months and begin to regress, and they never learn even to feed themselves or to sit up or to speak, and they die within a couple of years. So it's heartbreaking for the family. That used to be a much higher incidence in the Ashkenazi Jewish population, but because of screening programs, it's been reduced dramatically to the point now where the incidence of kids with Tay-Sachs are at lower level in the Ashkenazi population than they are in some other populations.
Huh. That's interesting.
That's been a success story.
Yeah, I should say.
The only drawback with that success story is that we tend maybe to forget that the genes are still there. Those recessive genes didn't disappear just because we are preventing the birth of those very, very disabled babies. Right. So those recessive genes are still there, and we have to be vigilant and continue to test for them.
Could you talk a little bit about perfect pitch?
Yes, of course. One of the issues with regard to evolution in human populations is the question of what is a good gene and what is a bad gene. And that means you're making a judgment about certain traits. The Nazis, of course, were notorious for judging genes and for eugenics programs where they had decided on what the ideal phenotype is, the Aryan race overall. And that led to the atrocities of the Holocaust and World War II. Now, we do know that certain genes cause disastrous and calamitous diseases, and those appear in higher incidence in certain populations. But there are many traits that are in certain populations that are wonderful and very positive, and perfect pitch is one of them. It turns out that, of course, perfect pitch is the ability to recognize a particular note when it's played on a musical instrument, and you could say, oh, that's B flat, or that's, F sharp. I don't have perfect pitch. Very few people do. It's partially determined by genetics and partially by environment. The genetic component, it turns out that genes that are responsible for that do appear in higher incidence in Ashkenazi Jews. That doesn't mean that all Ashkenazi Jews have perfect pitch. It's just a very small percentage. And there are some good examples. The Shaham family, Gil Shaham, these are musicians, very famous musicians, and a number of others. But there actually is a publication, or a couple of scientific publications, that address the issue of perfect pitch and the genetics behind the perfect pitch. So we don't have to stigmatize groups necessarily because of their genetic inheritance and the genetic predispositions. We can also find the positive genetic, various types of genetic markers and traits that different populations have passed down, and that's one example of it.
So how does your interest in genetics and in evolution relate to your interest in bioethics specifically?
Well, my interest in bioethics also relates to my interest in eugenics. I did, for many years, run and direct the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at William Paterson University, and I gave a lot of time and effort to thinking about the issues of eugenics, not only in Nazi Germany, but also eugenics today as used as considered within the framework of biotechnology and genetic technology in particular. So we have the power now to screen individuals and to screen fetuses, and then to decide what our genetic destiny will be, our genetic future will be. So we can eliminate certain pregnancies. We can make decisions about going forward with various types of reproductive, we make reproductive decisions, and that means we have more control over the genetic future of our children. Modern genetic technology gives us the power to make eugenic type decisions. For instance, we can use artificial reproductive technology where you do in vitro fertilization, and the couple can produce a dozen or dozens of embryos. Now those embryos can be tested, and the couple can select which embryos they want to implant and which embryos they would rather discard. So this is a very positive development if you're going to help a family have healthy children. The questionable part of this is in terms of making decisions that involve genetic enhancement. Perhaps we want children who are going to be taller. Maybe we want children who have other types of talents, even the musical talent, the idea of musical talent or artistic talent, or more beautiful children. There could be cosmetic things that you choose for, and that could be troubling to some people to consider that we have the ability to make those decisions, because we're talking now about sometimes about frivolous things that we're doing in terms of those decisions. Of course, health, it's easy to justify decisions that are made that reflect the health of our offspring, but it's more difficult to defend those that seem to be more frivolous and have to do with cosmetics and more superficial types of traits. But that's what genetic technology enables us to do. One of the things about genetic technology that concerns me is that we have the ability to choose using pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where you make embryos and then you can screen them, and you can find out all sorts of things about them. You can find out which embryos are girl embryos and which embryos are boy embryos, the female and the male. And there are families that say, well, I must have a girl or I must have a boy. That seems to be okay if it's for what's called family balancing. For instance, I have a niece who had 5 girls. If she had gone ahead and said, well, I really want to have a boy now and use the technology, then, you could say, well, we could justify that. That's okay. Most people would go along with it. And by the way, they did go on and have the 6th child, and it was a boy, but they didn't buy technology. Her sister had 6 boys. Now, you could justify saying, well, she could go on and do family balancing using technology and have her girl. And that would seem reasonable, right? Yeah. But by the way, she went on and she had her 7th child, and it's a girl. She used technology. But the question is, in certain populations where they only want boys, right, and they reject girls. And it's going to change the nature of the population, and it has in China, in certain parts of India, North Korea. They prefer male offspring for a variety of sociological reasons. And so in certain areas of the world, there's an imbalance between the male and female ratio, with many, many more males born than females. Now, some of
which may not have been such an issue when there was more active wars going on, or more, where you might be losing more of your male population down.
Yes. Although
but now luckily in a more peaceful state.
And by the way, you don't need high tech. Yeah, you don't need high tech ability to choose girls over boys. There are places where female infanticide is practiced to get rid of the baby girls, because they're just a burden on the family. Right. So you end up with imbalance, and the imbalance where you have many more boys than girls affects the future generations, because you have men who won't find mates.
Right.
And
social disorder, I would assume.
Social disorder, right, absolutely. So those are serious issues. Our ability to choose a gender is very powerful, and it's something we really need to do very carefully. The other issue that bothers me is that there are sperm donors who father dozens or more than dozens of children, and that could be a Brave New World kind of scenario. The use of sperm donation is troubling because it's overused, and it could also lead to genetic issues where you might have incest, unknowing incest, in future generations.
Could you talk a little bit about the importance of genetic diversity in the population?
Absolutely. One of the ways that technology has changed things is that we can make a lot of decisions, and we can eliminate some genes within the population. Not actually eliminate the genes, but eliminate individuals that have those disorders. So that means in the future there could be populations with less diversity. In particular, if groups and communities decide that there are certain traits that are absolutely
unaesthetic.
Yes. Here's an example of something that may be happening on a very small scale. There are families where the husband is experiencing infertility and may actually be sterile. But there are technologies which permit sterile males to reproduce biologically. They can get if there are only a couple of sperm in the testes, they can draw out those sperm and use them to fertilize the egg by actually shoving the sperm into the egg. That's called ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection. That means that those infertile men are becoming biological fathers. Now, the question is, will their sons also be infertile, and or even sterile? If that's the case, then the only way that next generation can reproduce would be artificially. So once we start with this type of artificial reproduction, is that going to generate or increase the incidence of individuals who have those problems? That's not to say that those people don't deserve to be biological parents, or we should do whatever we can.
Right.
But it's something to keep in mind that we are changing the frequency and distribution of certain traits within the population.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, we've been the so-called playing God. We've been doing that with technology now for decades, in that we are routinely saving babies that shouldn't be surviving. Little preemies that really wouldn't have any chance of surviving in nature are being rescued, and that is one way of practicing what's called artificial selection, where humans decide who's going to be part of our group and part of the population. It's like natural selection involves the natural forces, forces of nature, which confer advantages or disadvantages in survival. Artificial selection is when humans make those choices to rescue premature babies,
or to run a pogrom and kill off most of a village.
Yes, exactly right. To decide which groups don't deserve to live, not deserving to live. The Nazis wiped out handicapped people of all ages, kids, young adults, people with various types of physical disabilities were exterminated by the Nazis. And that was also artificial selection. By the way, the Nazis also conducted experiments where they forced people to have babies. They took blonde-haired, blue-eyed women and forced them to mate with blonde-haired, blue-eyed Nazi soldiers. And there were hundreds of babies born from that Lebensborn program. Now they're all grown up. They're actually elderly people who are living in Germany who were a result of those programs. They turned out to be ordinary people. In past years they've actually studied that group to see if there's anything special about them, but they're just regular folks.
Let's talk a little bit about your career path. You did a lot of different interesting things. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I came to be particularly interested in bioethics really by virtue of a lot of the experiences that I had as a scientist. I started to do research when the recombinant DNA technology emerged in the 1970s, in the late 70s and early 80s. So we were cloning genes, we were doing genetic engineering when it was still kind of controversial because people were a little bit wary about maybe there might be risks to ourselves and to our environment. And it turns out that that's not the case, and that the way it's practiced is actually quite safe and very positive in terms of developing new products and helping in human health. But that was an exciting time because of the controversy that surrounded the work that I was doing. And then I worked with in vitro fertilization right at its infancy. No pun intended, or yes, pun intended. But it was an exciting time because it was only a few years after the birth of Louise Brown, the first test tube baby, and we were kind of floundering around trying to figure out how to do it. It was a challenge. It was very, very exciting and interesting. And we had at Mount Sinai, infertile couples we wanted to help, and they produced some eggs, and I had to learn how to culture the eggs and put the eggs and the sperm together, and then they were embryos, and then there was a baby, and it was very, very exciting. So all of those experiences made me think a lot about the ethical implications of the science. And in the 90s, when the first mammal was cloned, that was Dolly the sheep.
You write about that in your book, that this was a very inspiring moment for you in terms of science writing.
It was, because everybody was screaming and yelling about the implications of cloning, and we're going to start cloning people, and who's going to be cloned? Donald Trump or Michael Jackson or the rich and the wealthy? Who's going to get cloned? That didn't happen yet. We haven't been able to clone people yet, but it did stimulate me to start to think and write about bioethics, and that's when I started to write for more popular types of publications I did want to communicate my interest, my excitement, and my concern about some of the issues as they relate to bioethics.
With cloning, they have done more with mammals, though, since the sheep, right? Maybe like farm animals, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's right on target. It's not as dramatically different from what people have been doing for hundreds or thousands of years with animal husbandry, because inbreeding also does lead to very homogeneous stocks of animals, and that type of risk has been around for a while. And in particular, crops, plants, various types of plant crops have been at risk because the diversity is very low and they're very homogeneous. So if something wipes out one strain of wheat, then it could wipe out a whole industry.
Right.
There are movements to conserve the diversity of various species by setting up banks,
seed saving,
and so on, so that we could have some resource to go back to in case we do have those types of things happening. But one of the things that we're able to do now that we couldn't do before is to genetically engineer the species, not only plants but also animals, and confer totally new traits on various types of species. And a good example are the goats that have been genetically engineered to produce human products, human pharmaceutical products. There are goats that have been made it's called transgenic animals that have been given the ability to produce and to secrete in their milk various types of pharmaceuticals that can be used to treat humans. Now those goats are like the goose that laid the golden egg.
Right.
Because you can just keep on milking them, and the milk carries with it this very, very valuable pharmaceutical product, which you can then go ahead and purify and sell it as a medicine, as a pharmaceutical product.
Are these goats able to reproduce, though?
That's an interesting question. They can reproduce, but the question is, will they transmit the same genes and the same genetic ability to their offspring? So I think they're working on that. Theoretically, they should be able to, but it doesn't always work so well. And making transgenic animals also is kind of a hit and miss type of a task, and when they do it, they usually have to do hundreds of trials before they get an animal that actually is doing what they want it to do. So it's not so easy, but when they do succeed, it's something totally new that didn't exist before, and that's very artificial and human made.
Is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you would like to speak to?
I think that we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
It can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes, because the science is very sophisticated. But I guess the take-home message is that we are all going to be affected by these issues, the issue of genetic technology and how it will affect us as individuals and us as a population, the human population. And at all levels, at the level of being able to screen a couple and give that couple the ability to choose what their family will be like, and the ability for vast populations to make decisions about what their future generations are going to look like. So I think that's the take-home lesson, is we should learn as much as we can and try to understand what the implications are.
Yeah.
So I wish you a lot of good luck with this publication, and with all of your important work to carry forth this message. And in these interesting political times, we need to be able to expose people to and educate them about the process of evolution.